Hey everybody, this is Brian Crescenti again. I'm the news editor at Polygon and a career journalist, most recently a game journalist. Today, this is sort of the second week in what will be, I don't actually know how many weeks, but 4 months roughly, mentorship that I'm doing on game journalism. And Andrea, whose last name I keep forgetting, what is your last name? Dietz?
Dietz, yeah.
It is Dietz. Excellent. I remembered after I asked. So Andrea's here, and unlike the first two, every time I'm going to be experimenting with formatting. First time it was a straight-up lecture. Second time was a roundtable. Today's topic is going to be reporting. It's very basic reporting stuff. I'm going to be talking about advanced reporting down the line, and about advanced sort of investigative reporting and also interview techniques. But this is sort of really basic for people who've never done any reporting before. So, Andrea, what I'm going to do is sort of walk through it a little bit. Excuse me, but feel free to interrupt, and also I'll take breaks so I can drink water, and you can ask
Sure.
questions too. So, yeah, I mean, as we talked about last week, the importance of journalism and why we need journalists and why you need to follow certain rules and certain techniques. It all comes down to making sure that your audience trusts you. And the best way to do that is by pursuing truth and reporting fact. So that sounds really basic, really easy, but how do you do that? So the best thing to do is to keep in mind what used to be, I think, the 4Ws? Maybe it was, yes, I think it was the 4W. Maybe it was the 5Ws. Anyway, basic questions. I still think about these sometimes when I'm reporting on a story and I'm doing an interview, and I think, have I gotten everything? I'll go through it. So it is who, what, when, where, why, and then how is the H. But we'll go through them. There's actually 6Ws now. Things have sort of changed over time, so there's extra questions that they invented. Go figure. So who is who is the story about? What happened? When did it take place? Where did it take place? Why did it take place? How did it happen? And then the new question, and I know this sounds silly, is what's next? It's something that a lot of people, journalism never really early on didn't focus on, but it's a good question to keep in mind and to ask. The how is, how did it happen? So if you typically go into an interview and get all of those questions answered, you are going to typically be able to write a story that satisfies the interest of your reader. And also, it's important to keep in mind that none of these are questions that can be answered with a yes or no. When you're interviewing people, and again, we'll go into in a later section, we'll go into a lot more detail about interviewing, but a really simple thing to keep in mind is try to avoid, unless you really just need to know yes or no, try to avoid asking questions that can result in a yes or no. Like, do you think the game is good? Or, did it do well? All of those are yes or no, and there are a lot of people who get nervous when they are interviewed, or maybe just aren't good at interviews. They'll answer yes or no, and you can't use that. It's unusable. So that's again the basics. It's interesting because I think we talked a little earlier, and you said you hadn't really ever done any interviewing. So I'm going to back up even more a little bit and talk about how you do those, how you track people down, because I think for basic reporting, that's something that people don't understand. So let's do a little example here and talk about something that happens all the time. You get a press release. Let's say it's for, we'll say Destiny. This is something that came out three times in the past week and a half or so. Destiny doing really well in sales. So the first press release said that they had sold in $500,000 worth of Destiny. The second one, I can't even remember what the second one was. And then the third one was that they had sold through, I forgot what the figure is. Oh, that's what it was. The second was that. The third was that it was some record. So all of those are press releases. You get them all the time. The basic structure of a press release is that it's essentially a news story. It has a lead that gets to the point really quickly, and then it has facts. There's usually a quote or two in there that they put in. All that's fine. but you want to go back and check all that information. The Destiny thing's a great example. There were sites, I won't point any fingers because this happens all the time, but there were sites that reported that Destiny sold, that Activision sold sorry, it wasn't 500,000, it was 500,000,000 in Destiny sales. And that isn't actually true. Sold in versus sold through are two very different things. Sold in means that Activision gave them to a bunch of retailers, and those retailers now have them sitting in their back rooms and in their warehouses and on their shelves. Sold through means that a customer actually purchased the game. There's obviously a significant difference between the two. The thought by some is that, well, a company's not going to overproduce these games and ship too many, but of course you keep in mind that they may just be wrong. They may guess wrong about how many are wanted and either undership or overship. The point of all of this is, if you don't pick up the phone and double check what all of this means, then your story is going to be wrong or could be wrong. So when you get a press release, it's always a good idea, I think, to try to challenge yourself to figure out, why do I need to get back in touch with this person, either via email or via phone. Personally, I prefer phone. And if you force yourself to get into the habit of doing that, you'll force yourself to start looking for holes in the stories, which is a big part of journalism, and also get more comfortable with that idea of going to these people. So going back to this example, you get this press release, you read through it, you want to have a full understanding of what exactly the press release says, and in theory, understand what it means. But then you go and you contact the press person. Don't feel bad about asking very basic questions. In fact, I often will ask very basic questions. I pride myself on asking stupid questions because they often will give you the best answers. Stupid questions are another way of saying questions that nobody asks. And a lot of times, things that everybody assumes are either wrong or have really interesting answers. So you want to take that information. Typically, there's a contact info on the press release. Typically email, often phone. Get a hold of the person, identify yourself, say, I'm Brian Crescenti, I'm a reporter with Polygon, I'm working on a story about Destiny sales, I just had a few questions for you, and then just kind of walk through it. And again, if you don't know what question to ask, go through those 6 W's and that 1 H, and just methodically ask those questions. If things have come up like you see sold in, and you think, well, what the hell does sold in mean? Ask them, and they'll give you an answer. Never assume anything. This goes back to the first lesson. You can't base your stories on assumption. It's the best way that you can make a huge mistake on a story. You want to verify all the facts. When you write a story up after you've done the basic reporting, actually, going back to the interview, when you're doing the interview, you want to double check everything, like the spelling of names, the person's title. If for some reason you were to include a phone number in the story, which is pretty rare for game journalism, but if you were going to, not only double check that phone number, but call it, because the last thing you want to do is put some person's phone on the internet for, I don't know, some deal, and then it turns out it's some poor guy's or woman's phone who has nothing to do with any of this. It's very hard to take that back. So go out of your way to check these things. So just as, again, that's sort of a very basic beginning. Do you have any questions about that, or what sort of questions do you have about sort of dipping your toe in doing some initial reporting?
Okay, well, what if you call someone and they have absolutely no interest in talking to you at all? Do you keep pushing them to talk to you, or do you just try to call someone else?
That's a good question. PR people, in general, it's their job to speak with you. They're paid to do that. Don't be snippy or rude with them, but and don't waste their time. Of course, you want to have your questions thought out, and you want to make sure that you're going to write something. This is another pet peeve of mine. I hate doing interviews and not turning it into a story because I feel like I've wasted a lot of people's time. If you have to, you have to, but I try to avoid that. But yeah, typically they will. If they won't answer your questions, though, there are, in an example like this, there are plenty of PR people in that one company. Go to all of them. Don't be bashful. I will literally go down and call every single person. One of the best skills you can learn or surface is tenacity in reporting. That doesn't mean being obnoxious. It doesn't mean getting in people's faces. What it does mean is not giving up. So in a recent example, the I've suddenly forgotten how to pronounce her last name. Sarkeesian story, yes, about the FBI investigation. They just did not want to talk to me. Like, it was very obvious. The police didn't want to talk to me. The FBI didn't want to talk to me. So I ended up placing 13 calls to the FBI, sent 5 or 6 emails to them. Before I talked to the FBI or tried to talk to the FBI, I was calling the police spokesperson every hour for 3 days during my work shift. So that's 20 to 30 phone calls. I wasn't leaving messages every time because I'm not harassing him, but I would leave 1 or 2 messages during the day. I'd be very polite, but then I'd call him every single hour until I get an answer. I emailed him. He didn't provide his email address. I did a bit of sleuthing, figured out the format for the email addresses at the San Francisco Police Department, and then figured out his and sent him an email. And I did that a couple of times a day. I think eventually he just got sick of me and decided to get back to me. And again, I wasn't rude. I would never be rude. I'm not going to be obnoxious. I am going to be tenacious because it is my job to do this, and it is my obligation to do this. And for whatever reason, maybe he was super busy, maybe he didn't like me, maybe he didn't like the story. Could have been a million things, but the reality is I've got to get that answer, so I'm going to get that answer. With the FBI, I ended up figuring out, again, the format for the email, and I emailed every single special agent at the FBI. That was my last attempt. And the next day, one of them called me back because probably someone got in trouble. But you need to be tenacious. And again, I know I keep saying this, but I can't say it enough. It never, ever, ever helps to be rude. I love referring to some of the things I do, referring to different TV characters. I talked about Columbo. I think I talked to you about Columbo, doing the Columbo in interviews. I call this doing the, God, I'm so bad with names. James Garner. Maverick? No, it's not Maverick. I can't.
I was going to try to be of some help.
Rockford Files. So Rockford Files, a guy's a PI, if you haven't seen the show, and he gets all kinds of information. He doesn't do it by harassing people. He doesn't do it by being obnoxious or threatening them or paying for things. He does it by being charming. And the reality is, if you're nice to people, they will be much more willing to help you than if you're obnoxious. And also, it's not just about getting something. You should, in general, be a nice person. I don't want to come off like I'm only nice when I want something. But anyway, the point is, be tenacious. Don't be obnoxious. Don't allow it to become emotional. This is not something that you should ever take personally in terms of you getting a hold of people. They should understand that this is you doing your job, and you certainly should understand that. So don't feel like you're bothering them, because you're not bothering them. You're doing your job, and they should be doing their job. That was a really long answer. Do you have any other questions?
Okay, I guess tenacity would be more of a learned skill for me, because I feel like I'm kind of introverted in a way. So is that just something that comes with practice, or that's what I'm assuming?
Yes. So my wife doesn't believe this when I say it, but I am an introvert. I call myself an introvert extrovert. Because of doing reporting for so long, I've been able to establish essentially an identity that is very extroverted, because I know, I've got to write my stories. And I can be shy all I want, but the reality is I will lose my job if I don't write my stories. So you have to get over it. It did help that I spent one summer as a telemarketer, which certainly teaches you some techniques. But it all, again, comes back to being nice. In terms of getting over being uncomfortable with talking to people or reaching out to people, it is partly personality, but honestly, a lot of it is learned behavior. In game journalism, we tend to do a lot more phone journalism or email journalism. Most newspapers, that's not the case. You do in-person journalism. And to this day, I still feel so awkward doing like man-on-the-street stories, or stories where I just have to go up to a crowd of people and randomly pick someone and start interviewing them. I hate doing that. It makes me feel so uncomfortable, but you have to do it. And you just, nothing bad is going to happen. the worst thing that'll happen is that you screw up, but then just go to the next person. But yeah, just know that everybody is uncomfortable the first time they do that. And the first few times, for the first week, the first month, it just takes a while. But yeah, you build up that skill, and you start to get a sense of why you need to do this, and it's fun. You know, it's getting people to talk to you about things is fun on many levels because it is educational. And if you're most journalists, I think, naturally like to learn things. I love learning stories. I love hearing stories. I love learning new information. It always fascinates me. So that sort of part of you, that facet of you, will always be satisfied because you're doing this. And if you feel nervous, just remember, you know, it's a job. You have to do it, and there's no other way to do this. And it's sort of, for me at least, provides you a little armor in terms of not feeling comfortable.
Cool. Well, that's helpful.
So let me go through some other stuff. Other things that I want to remind you of. I talked a lot about how you have to be accurate and you have to sort of really double check everything. It's very important to never assume anything. Fun little story that I like to tell people is that in newspapers, they do something called truth squatting. And what truth squatting is when you get a group of people together who aren't on a story you've written, and they discuss, basically they try to tell you that your story's wrong. So, you know, you're like, hey, I'm trying to think of not a violent story from my history. But yeah, Call of Duty. I just found out everything about the new Call of Duty game. Hasn't been announced yet. I'm going to break all the news. Then you have people come in and say, well, are you sure the person didn't just make that up? And, you know, this sounds super generic, and the video that they gave you doesn't really look like a video produced by a professional company. And they come in and just try to shoot holes in your story, not to be mean, but because by doing that, it allows you to make sure that you have filled all those holes, that you've questioned it yourself, that you've verified it's true. The funny part of this is I had always thought, and I think it was for, 15, maybe 20 years, that it was truth squatting, as in squatting on the truth, which makes no sense, by the way. And the irony here is I never checked. And I just assumed that's what it was. And this is a prime example of why you don't do that. Don't make assumptions, because you will then spend 15 years with a ridiculous image in your head whenever someone says truth squatting. So don't make assumptions. Truth squatting is a great thing to do because, again, it allows you to go to other people. Naturally, when you write a story and do reporting, you are going to feel like you've done everything you have to do. Because, of course, we're all infallible and we never make mistakes. So it's super helpful to have someone come in and say, no, actually, you forgot tons of things, and this is a mistake, and what about this thing? And then you can kind of make sure that you're on solid ground. Some of the things that you really want to triple, quadruple check, I already mentioned one of them, but check the spelling of every name. I don't care if their name is John Smith. I have had, especially as a police reporter, every conceivable spelling of every name that you can imagine. And people hate to have their names misspelled. So no matter how common that name is, no matter how stupid it might make you feel, double check the spelling of the name with the person, not with some friend or a PR person. The person you're interviewing, ask them how to spell their own name. Get their title. Make sure you understand what their title is. I mean, not what it is, but like what it means. Make sure if you ever have a concern, if someone's talking and they say something and you write it down and you think, God, that's weird, stop them. Unless it's a great quote. Let them finish a quote, but then stop them and say, hey, you said this thing. What does that mean? Or did I hear you correctly? Or can you explain that a little bit more? Because a lot of times people mishear or you take down bad notes. Check your understanding of a topic. So it's very easy, going back to the idea of no stupid questions, your entire understanding of something may be based on an assumption that is absolutely incorrect, and it could completely screw up your story. So just make sure that you really understand what it is you're covering, and that you ask the person the basics. let's see what else. Objectivity. We talked a little bit about objectivity. Again, it's not about you being objective. It's about you intellectually being objective through the use of all of these tools we're talking about in terms of double checking, getting multiple sources, finding multiple angles. Some of the warning signs that you are too vested in your story and that maybe you shouldn't be the one writing it are things like trying to shape your facts around a preconceived notion. Reporting on a story because of the outcome you think you already know. Making sure that you approach a story with a desire to tell the story versus to tell the story you want to tell is the best way to get around that and to thwart sort of accidentally bringing in preconceived notions. And to do that, what you have to do is follow the facts. So not your ideas of the facts, but the facts. So make sure you sort of step back and you get all the basics, that you ask questions, and in doing your interviews that you follow those questions through with other questions so that you're not just going there and kind of, it doesn't matter if the person's present. That you're just kind of going through 7 questions or 20 questions that you have written down. You want to listen and respond to them. And then, of course, always try to get second sources to verify stories, especially if the story sounds incredulous to you or if there's some sort of issue with the story. Let's see. I think that's another pausing point. What sort of questions do you have over that sort of stuff?
Okay, so say if, like, I obviously have biases, everyone does, like making sure that those don't, kind of rear their ugly heads in stories seems, because I may think that they're not there, but they might be there. So I'm like, with the fact checking and everything, is there like any tip, or like do you just have other people read things to make sure that, your own personal viewpoint doesn't sway the story in some way?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it really does come back to this idea that you're not doing journalism of affirmation. You're not reaffirming something you think you already know. So I will do this later. It's a fun technique. I need to find a good example. But when I was applying for the Knight Ridder mentorship, they flew us all out to, I can't remember where the hell it was, somewhere, some newspaper. And we were tested. We had to do an AP style test. We had to do a grammatical test. And then the most interesting test was there was a reporter, a staff reporter, who was in a room, and you had to go into the room by yourself, and that reporter was supposed to be essentially all the people in a story that you were writing about. And the story was a failed attempt at a robbery of a convenience store where a person was killed. And so you're supposed to go in, and all the people who are, they give you the basic facts, but they're supposed to play the role of the police spokesperson, the witness, the suspect, everybody. And you can ask whatever you want, and then when you're done, you have, I think it's a half an hour. When you're done, you leave, and you go and write a news story based on the notes you took, and then you take that news story and you rewrite it as a wire story, which is a little different, and then as a radio story, which is typically much shorter. The interesting point is that it's a great example of following the facts, because what ends up happening, what happened was that the story had a set of facts built into it that played to preconceived notions. So if you didn't really ask every single question of every person, your story would have been absolutely wrong. You wouldn't have realized, I think in this case, that an 80-year-old woman grabbed a shotgun and shot somebody. Like, you would have thought it was, someone else. It was very easy to get wrong, but only if you thought it was, the 2 young guys, the one being the clerk and one being the person who came in to do the robbery, who were involved, and you didn't actually double check everything. And so, you're right. Everybody has preconceived notions. Everybody has bias. But if you follow the facts, and you're an intelligent person, and you are obviously an intelligent person, I don't think it'll be a problem.
Okay.
It sounds like magic, but it really is just a matter of you're playing detective essentially. Just don't assume things. It's a little harder to do with game journalism because most people who cover video games typically have a high level of knowledge, or at least believe they do. And so they come in with a huge amount of preconceived notions and biases, and sometimes don't question those. And I think that can lead to a little bit of wonkiness sometimes, but it's still, those rules still apply, and they'll still be super helpful for you. As we go through this, and as you start doing reporting, and we start checking them, and we do a little bit of, like I said, we'll do some role play. I have to find a really good story that's confusing to get you to do the interviewing for. But after we do that, you'll start to see, and then we can sort of identify some of these issues. But I think you'll find that it's a lot more powerful than it sounds like it is.
Okay.
What other questions do you have?
Let me see here. I know I have them.
That's all right. I can talk some more. Assumption.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're a Three Stooges fan, but I am, and there's a Three Stooges skit, show, whatever you would call it, where they write up on a chalkboard the old assumption thing, which is when you assume, you make an ass of you and me, and they circle the you, the me, and the ass. So never, ever, ever assume. I'm going to probably say this 1,000 times over the course of this year, because it is the worst thing you can do as a journalist. Don't trust people, not because they're deliberately trying to confuse you or lie to you. More often than not, it's because they're using shorthand to describe things, and you're using shorthand to understand things. And those shorthands don't ever intersect. That happens sometimes. So just, like I said, be very careful. So I want to talk a little bit about the process of taking notes, because you had mentioned, like I said earlier, that you hadn't done interviews before. There's a couple things. There's some skills that you're going to want to learn or that you already have. Typing quickly, super useful. So note-taking, there's multiple ways to take notes. I think everybody who wants to be a reporter should learn to write quickly in a notepad. And that means, I have one laying around here somewhere, but that means being able to pick out when someone's like while I'm talking to you, don't write verbatim every word I say, because you'll never keep up with handwriting. Shorthand doesn't really allow you to do verbatim, but instead choose the thing that you think is going to be most powerful or most interesting, and either write it out as a direct quote or write it as a shorthand fact. So you're writing about some game that's being announced, and they tell you the modes. You don't need quotes for those modes. All you have to do is write down what the modes are in a quick description. But when they say something that's really interesting and meaningful that describes why they have those 4 modes, maybe you want to write all those that quote down verbatim. This is sort of going to cross over a little bit into writing, but a good thing to keep in mind when writing and when taking notes is that quotes really are meant to be the seasoning of your story. You don't want to have a story that is entirely quotes. That often is a sign that you're not contextualizing or synthesizing the information. You want to use those quotes because the way that person said that thing was amazing. If they're just saying the game has, 6 playable characters and 3 modes, there is no reason to quote that. Just write it and summarize it, because you can do a better job writing than most people can do talking. So anyway, when you're taking notes, the first thing you should learn is start practicing. Get a notepad. Start practicing writing on a notepad. They sell reporters' notebooks. You can get them at office supply stores. Just get used to writing in that. I could tell you about some techniques I used, but really everybody develops their own techniques on how to take good notes. I will say, use a pencil. Don't use a pen. Pens are evil. They freeze. They leak. They melt. If you accidentally put your notes in the dishwasher. If it somehow gets into the washing machine or it gets rained on, and I've had both of these things happen to me, you will end up with a completely blank piece of paper. If you write it in pencil, 9 times out of 10, all your notes will be there, but the lines will be gone. Pencil is fantastic. You can sharpen a pencil with anything if you have to. It doesn't run. It doesn't run out. You're not going to be surprised by it's not working. Pencils are fantastic, and you can kill vampires with them. So
it's a double bonus.
It's a double bonus. I'm going to try to find. Oh man, I know I have a notebook around here. So okay, give me another question while I root around back here trying to find a notepad.
Okay, well, what if like you can't read your own handwriting? Like, do you, you're kind of screwed then. So I guess I have to work on my handwriting.
So okay, that is such a good segue. Let me show you. Here we go. I don't know if this is going to turn out. Here we go. Can you see
Yes.
that?
Yeah.
Is it backwards or is it mirrored?
I think I can actually read it.
But I'm just pointing out my handwriting is shit, and it is when people see it, they sometimes are like, do you know shorthand? And I'm like, nope. Nor do I know how to write in English. So my point is that like you will develop a way to be able to write and read your own stuff.
Okay,
I have all kinds of things I do. I underline. I use shorthand that I've invented, like the letter B and K means because. So I do a lot of weird things like that I just, because I've been taking notes for so long. You need to learn to do that because there will be a time when you're standing in a crowd and you have to take notes.
yeah.
So do that. Learn that. Learn to type quickly. The best thing you can do in terms of timeliness and turning a story quickly is to take your notes directly into your laptop. I say that because any other method involves you having to take those notes and put them into your laptop before you write the story. So if you could skip that step and type your notes directly into your laptop, then you're set. And you can't always because you have to sit down typically to do that. But if there are plenty of interviews where you'll have that opportunity. Absolutely do it. I don't know how well you type. I will say the more you do this, the more you type. One thing you should work on is being able to type without looking at your keyboard, because I find doing interviews, it's helpful to be able to maintain eye contact while speaking. Again, ironic that I looked away when I said that. Sorry. Looking how long we've been going. But maintaining eye contact while you type is important, I think, or while you interview people, because they understand that you're paying attention to them and they don't get distracted. They kind of sink into the rhythm of a conversation. So you should work on that as well. The third method, my least favorite, but frankly it's a good backup, is record. I do not record every interview I do. I tend to only record interviews where I know that I'm going to be doing a big story that is a long interview. I interview Ken Levine, and I know that I'm going to do 2,000 to 3,000 words. I'll record it because I'm probably going to squeeze every single thing he said out of him and put it in the story in some way or another, either by direct quote or by thought. And I know that my notes are pretty spot on, but they're not that spot on in terms of not having any gaps in what he says. Also, for really intense interviews, it's great to not have to take notes. That said, to this day, I get so nervous when I am not doing anything but recording, because if that recording gets lost, doesn't take, there's some problem, all these things have happened to me, you're completely screwed. So I would say learn to write and take notes in a notepad, perfect your typing and note taking, and use audio backup so you can transcribe. In terms of note taking, what you're writing down typically is not verbatim, it's the facts, and then it is, as I said, the quotes that you think are powerful quotes. Try not to only write that one sentence, though, because you definitely don't want to take quotes out of context. And I think it helps a lot to have that, especially if it's a strong quote, to have that sort of padding around the quote. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say strong. If it's a quote that's contentious, you want to make sure that you give them plenty of lead up to it, so that even if people are upset about what was said, there's no lack of context there, because that's something that can happen inadvertently if you're being too precise or too precious with your use of quotes. Any questions about that?
No, I was going to ask when to use which type of note-taking thing, but you kind of answered that one.
Yeah, I would say, yeah, always try to type. Typing is the best because, again, it saves time. So let's see. Phone interviews, essentially the same thing. I try to use hands-free whenever possible. I have a mechanical keyboard. This is getting very nitty-gritty, but because of that, everybody, like in the state, can hear me typing. And it's kind of funny because I don't take verbatim notes, And I feel bad because I know that when I'm interviewing people, they're probably like, why hasn't he written any of the cool things I've said yet? Because they can totally hear the keyboard. So to kind of I think sometimes what I do is I'll switch over to headphones so they can't actually hear the clicking with a different sort of mic. And then maybe it's a little more directed. But there's tools, we can talk about some of the specific tools you can use, but I don't think that needs to be in this. Trying to go through the process. So interviewing, going out on the scene or going out to an area where you have to interview people, really there's no difference. You have to get used to approaching people, but you just identify yourself and then just start asking questions. It's a conversation. Most people, despite what you see on TV, do not get hostile towards you when you start asking questions. They understand you're a human being and that you just want to get answers. If you come across to them as a curious person who wants to inform their readers, typically they'll work with you. What other questions do you have about reporting?
Okay, well, I guess going up to interview people is probably one of my biggest fears because I feel like if you don't seem, it's not that you want to seem overly assertive, but if you seem like perhaps a pushover, maybe they won't want to talk to you. So I don't know if there's any way you approach people that makes them more likely to talk to you, but I have this irrational fear that I will start walking up to someone and they will just like turn around and start walking away from me.
So first off, if they do, chase them. Yeah, so they won't. You should psych yourself up for an interview. Whenever I do interviews, I'm always prepared, but if I'm doing, I'm trying to think of the last big interview where I got a little nervous about it, and I've done a lot of interviews, but there have been interviews in my career where I was like, okay, I can't screw this up. Not in gaming, but I interviewed a serial killer in prison, and he confessed a bunch of crimes to me. And that was one that I spent days preparing for and was very nervous about for a multitude of reasons. But yeah, people typically won't do that. What you do need to do, though, is you have to be prepared. Don't go to an interview about the latest Call of Duty not knowing what Call of Duty is. Don't go and interview the head of EA and think he's the vice president of EA. Because all of those things are things that are going to make them think that you don't know what the hell you're talking about and you're wasting their time. Yeah. So be prepared. Don't be overly, this is something I notice a lot of, and it's a pet peeve of mine. Don't be overly formal. They're not royalty. I've never in my life used honorifics. I don't call people Mr. or Mrs. or Miss or Sir or Ma'am. I don't like people calling me any of those, especially Ma'am. But I think that when you do it, maybe this is crazy talk, but I feel like when you do that in an interview, you're elevating them in such a way that maybe they won't take you as seriously. Instead of you going to them and saying, hey, I have questions I want to talk to you about, and let's have a conversation. Don't go there like, oh my God, you invented Legend of Zelda. You're my hero. I need to ask you some questions. And then sort of say, Mr. Miyamoto, do you mind if I ask you this one thing? And I know you're super busy. Don't worry about any of that. Just cut out all the bullshit and get to asking questions. I promise you, all those people would prefer that to you sort of scraping and bowing while you're doing it. Not that you would ever do that, but I'm just saying. So yeah, I think going in, knowing your information is very important. Going in and being secure, and you should be. You are talented. I don't know anybody on the planet, including 5-year-olds, who don't know how to ask questions. It's the easiest thing in the world. The hard part is actually then writing down what they say. Like, it's not that hard. Yeah. Now, there's levels of skill, but if you can go in and ask those, who came up with this game idea? Why did they come up with this game idea? What does the game idea mean? When is the game coming out? How is this game different from all the other games in this genre? Interview's done.
Yeah.
That's a basic interview. And I would highly recommend you do those basic ones first. Then you move on to the more advanced stuff where you go from asking these basic questions to having a conversation, and some of the other techniques we'll talk about down the line. But I understand. I'm getting a little better, but I had, certainly in high school and college, an enormous fear of public speaking. Absolutely hated it. I'd get butterflies. I'd get sweaty. I mean, like days ahead of time. Couldn't stand it. And that included interviews because in many ways, I think a lot of us, not in a positive way, in a negative way, view it as a performance. Like people are watching you while you ask a question. But it isn't. It's a conversation. And when was the last time you got nervous when you just had a conversation with somebody?
Yeah.
So I know I could say this until I'm blue in the face, but until you do it 2 or 3 times, you're going to be nervous. So
Okay.
just just hold on.
Well, that already makes me less nervous because if you think about it as just asking questions, and I think it's like I overly think about, I mean, the other person is not really concerned what you're going to say, they're concerned with what they're going to say. So,
Right.
I just have to ask questions, and they have to really do all the hard work.
Yeah, and really, if you want to be nervous about things, be nervous about getting your facts right and
Yeah.
story. And the reporting part's the easy part. That's the fun part. The writing part is where you have to tiptoe, and make sure you don't mess anything up and you present it in a way that people understand. So let's talk a little bit about specifically for games. Let's talk about previews and events. I said before, I think last week, that it's in my mind it's very important that if you're going, this was in the roundtable, if you're going somewhere, there should be evidence that you went to that place. So if the story you wrote, let's say you go to a preview event, if the story you wrote is identical to the story you would have written if you had done an interview with the same people over the phone, then there's something missing. There should be some element of you being there, some sort of sense of location in that story, either literally or maybe not so literally. Like you don't have to say I'm standing in a hotel, but there should be something gained from you going there. And I think if you keep your eyes open and look around, which is another very important thing that reporters don't do, it'll help a lot. So let's talk a little bit about that. I talked about the questions you ask a person, but don't forget that location can be just as big a deal as the interview or the setting. If you're interviewing Bill Gates and you write this story and it's fantastic, and you fail to mention that you interviewed him on a subway ride, right? That's super interesting, isn't it? Why the hell were you on a subway interviewing Bill Gates? So keep that in mind. Like, keep your eyes open. When you go to an event, play the game, do the interviews, but look around. Every time I go to an event, I do a walk around. I walk around not only to see the games, but I just want to see where I am. I want to see what the location looks like. I want to see if there's something that strikes me that maybe ties to the story I'm writing about. There are so many examples. I can't even. Okay, here's an observation example. When I was in Florida, I got one of these general assignment stories, which is essentially anybody can do it. And it was a weekend. And I was told to go cover some people from Sarajevo who were in town to talk about the trials and tribulations of their journey out of Sarajevo. This was back in early 90s or mid 90s. It's a story that basically you would sit there, listen to them talk. You're in the audience. It's a big auditorium. You would take notes. You would then maybe go up and ask a couple of questions, and you'd write the story. And that's what my competition did. What I did was all those things, but I also was paying attention to everything going on, and I noticed that when the adult, there were, I think, 3 people on stage, 2 parents and a child. And I noticed during the talk, the child was making this weird face, and she kept opening her mouth and closing it and opening her mouth, and then finally she turned around and ran off the stage, and we didn't see her again. It wasn't like a huge deal because, she's a little girl. She was like 12. So no one else seemed to notice or at least asked about it. After the talk and everybody did their interviews and no one was around, I said to the dad, I said, "Hey, I noticed that your daughter didn't look like she was doing okay and she ran off stage. What happened?" And he said, "Oh, she threw up. Every time we talk about this, she throws up." And it's like, that was my lead. And it was a powerful story. I mean, that's a powerful example of how this impacts people. And the point is, that's something that you can only get through observation. Like, that's not something that you're going to ask, and it's certainly not something he's going to bring up on his own. So observe. You're there to ask questions. You're there to play games, but you're there also to observe the world that all of this is taking place in. Now I'm going to do a little bit of reading here out loud, not to myself, about how I have always told people, at least at Polygon and also at Kotaku, how to cover previews and events. So I'm going to read this. Hopefully I haven't reread it to make sure. This is something I wrote a long time ago. Previews are inherently news events created by developers and publishers to impart new information about a game to reporters, typically with a strong time peg. As with interviews and other news events, you should go to these events prepared with not only an understanding of what has already been reported on the game, but also what angles you might explore. With that in mind, it's also important to keep your eyes and mind open to other stories that may pop up during an event. That includes pursuing strong feature ideas or video pieces that can be pinned to the event. While a reporter may come away from an event with an opinion about the current state of a game and its future potential, they should also leave with a solid idea of what new information came to light during the event through gameplay and interviews. The news story or stories that come out of these events should clearly explain to readers what new information came to light, what the game's current state is, and what you personally found interesting. Interviews at the event that push deeper into those new elements or other interesting angles will go a long way in helping our preview coverage stand out. The best sort of story would be a story with a solid hook or angle that pursues and explains the new information and provides color and light opinion through immersive gameplay explanation. The right balance will lean more heavily towards news, but remember to place the reader in the game at some point. There will be occasions when you discover that there are both timely news stories and long-term features that come out of these events. Make sure that you handle both appropriately. I think that's really it. So the point is, previews, I think, have been, a lot of people have sort of fallen into this trap of going there and writing what is essentially an early review. You know, I press A and the character jumps, I press B and he punches, and the graphics looked kind of cool, but they need improvement, and this thing worked and this thing didn't. That's not what you should do at previews. What you should do at previews is play the game or whatever they're allowing you to play, and then find the thing that you find compelling and use your gameplay as essentially the color for the story you really want to tell, which is, you know, how did Rockstar treat addiction in Max Payne? That was one of the stories I did from a Max Payne preview event. I talked about the gameplay a little, but what most of my story was about was how they treated his alcoholism in the story, and that's what my interviews were about. And I ended up getting a much better story, I think, than had I written something that just said, "This is what it feels like to push buttons."
Mm-hmm.
What questions do you have about that?
Ooh. Okay, well, what if, so say you find something personally interesting, but you think no one else is going to find it personally interesting. Like, I don't know, I guess it's like, how do you pursue those things that you may not necessarily think are a story, or I don't, do you know what I'm trying to get at? Okay.
No, I think what you're getting at is news value and news judgment.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the worst thing about journalism. That is, if nothing else is, and I think it all is, that is something that you can only learn through experience. I can't just say, okay, read this book, and it will give you news judgment. It's something you have to gain through experience, through working at a publication, through watching what things are covered and what things aren't, and through sort of learning your own mind and how it fits in with the community you're writing for. So one of the things I tell people is, if they're talking about it with each other, another pet peeve of mine, you know, in whatever place I've ever worked, there's always a public chat room, private chat room for all the reporters. And there'll be times where everybody's talking about this story and they're like, oh, wow, it's great. And then they all go off to work on stories and that story never gets covered. And it's like, guys, if this was so fascinating that you talked about it for 30 minutes, don't you think the readers want to hear about it too? So it's that sort of thing. It's a learned skill, but it's something that really kind of goes back to a really basic idea of what is interesting. And yes, there is a framework within which things are and aren't interesting, but there's also this bar of gray, and that's where things get tricky.
Yeah.
You know, worst case though, you write a story that no one finds interesting. Like, the world's not going to end.
Yeah.
And you learn. But I think a good reporter can make any story interesting. I I personally like to try to have more than one source in any story I write. Single source stories tend to be, whether they are or not, tend to feel more like PR-driven stories because that single source is usually someone who's very tied to the discussion or to the story and has an interest in it. And they're not going to tell you that it sucks or why it's bad or whatever. Bringing in another source who's not part of that can, if nothing else, add a facet to the story, make it more interesting, but also maybe poke holes in it. That said, if they announce the next GTA, I don't know if I'd run out before I wrote that story to find a second source. You have to balance when that's important and when you want to do it. Maybe hit the first story and then come back, go out and find some experts in pop culture and on game development and write a bigger story for your follow-up. But yeah, there's sort of an array of things you want to do in doing this sort of reporting. I think this is a good start. If you were right now, if I were to assign you a story, are there things that you feel like you wouldn't know what to do? Like if I said go write up this press release, are there any questions you want me to answer before you did that?
No, I could. Well, I mean, obviously I can say this now, but I haven't done it yet. I think I could do it, is what I'm trying to tell you. Like, I don't think I have any questions about that.
Okay. Don't fall into the trap, just to reiterate, of feeling like you're putting people out if you're asking them questions. Don't ever feel like you shouldn't pick up a phone to call a PR person or shouldn't email them. If they don't respond, keep doing it or find other people to talk to. All of those things are okay, they're natural, and they're part of what you're supposed to do.
Okay.
So what I want to do, we can wrap this up, but what I'd like to do is assign you a press release to write, and I want you to do all the reporting, which means you can do this sometime before, let's say, gosh, if you can, before Monday. It means I want you to either email or call the press person listed on the press release, do an interview, tell them you're writing it for your website. What is the name of your website again? I know it's not a gaming site.
It's just AyersDeets.com, so it's AyersDeets.com.
Okay. Yeah, just tell them you're writing it for a website, and if they ask which one, say it's AyersDeets.com.
Okay.
You know? There are plenty of people who have an audience of 2 who do this. No reason you shouldn't do good journalism because your audience isn't large. Those 2 have nothing to do with one another.
Okay.
So I'll hunt up a press release. I have plenty, and assign it to you. And I want you to come back to me at any point and ask me questions. If you don't know what questions to ask, if you're not sure of who you want to get a hold of, any of that stuff, feel free to contact me. And trying to think if you should. Yeah, go ahead and write it, and we can use that to segue into next week, which I believe is writing.
Sure.
That is writing, right? Isn't that?
Yeah.
Okay, so that'll be perfect. So you can do a little reporting now on that, and then we'll segue into next week. Thank you so much. I'm sorry this was on a Thursday. In terms of reading, I gave you a bunch of book assignments last week, which I know is taking up a lot of time. I need to find a good book for you to read. What I will say is this: do you read newspapers?
Yeah, I get the Chicago Trib to my mom, and then I have a subscription to the New York Times.
Okay, so do me a favor. When you're reading those stories, don't do it with every story, but when you're reading those stories, try to deconstruct it in your head. So look at a basic story and think, okay, what questions did they have to ask to get to the bottom of this story? What was the why? What was the who? And kind of look at it that way. Look at it analytically to see if you can sort of, again, deconstruct the reporting that went into writing that piece. So I'd like you to start doing that with your news stories. Also, choose a game site, and I don't care which one it is, any of them, and do the same thing. If you feel like you're following a game site that doesn't do a lot of reporting, that's fine too. Just make sure you identify that. So don't read. If a site is not doing any original reporting and they're just rewriting press releases, I don't want you to think, excuse me, that that's a good thing, but I think you can look at those stories and think, okay, this is how you should have done it or how I would have done it. So that's sort of your homework along with the other thing for I guess, the next few days.
Cool. I will do that, and I will ask you a bunch of questions.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you and take care.
Thanks, Brian.
You're welcome. Bye.
Bye.